NUS. A cold October rain mingled with sweat and blood. Underfoot, the ground was a squelching, sucking mire. The air hummed, not with bees, but with the thrum of thousands of drawn bowstrings. It was a sound that struck terror into the hearts of European knights. October 25th, 1415. The battlefield of Agincourt. An English archer, whose name history has not preserved, saw the target of his life before him. 200 yards away, through the chaos of steel and screams, he saw it. Golden lilies on a blue background, the royal standard of France, and beneath it, a figure in shining armor. The king. One shot, and the war could end. One well-placed arrow, and the entire French army, decapitated and demoralized, would falter. The fate of two nations rested at his fingertips. He drew back the string of his yew-long bow, putting all his strength and years of training into the motion. He aimed and shot at a richly dressed knight next to the king. Why? It was no mistake, and he was not alone. Thousands of other archers that day released volleys of arrows, turning French nobility into pincushions. They killed dukes, counts, and barons. But not a single arrow was deliberately aimed at the most important man on the battlefield. This act seems absurd, insane, especially considering the English position. Their army was smaller, exhausted by dysentery and hunger, cornered by superior enemy forces. Killing an enemy leader wasn't just a tactic. It was their only chance for survival. And they had the weapon to do it. The English longbow was the machine gun of the Middle Ages. An experienced archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. 10,000 archers meant 100,000 deadly projectiles flying at the enemy every minute. A wall of steel and wood capable of piercing armor. So perhaps they simply couldn't see the king? No. Leaders in those times didn't hide. They were beacons for their armies. Their armor and coats of arms were visible from afar. They needed to be seen. Perhaps hitting him was too difficult. Also, no. These men had trained since childhood. They could hit an apple from hundreds of paces. Killing a knight next to the king was no less difficult than killing the king himself. So why didn't they do it? The answer has nothing to do with marksmanship, ballistics, or the strength of armor. It is much deeper and more paradoxical. This archer's decision not to shoot the king was governed by invisible laws that were stronger than the instinct for self-preservation and a commander's order. To understand this seemingly insane act, we need to forget about arrows and bows and talk about something far more powerful: money. To understand medieval warfare, you must imagine it not as a patriotic struggle, but as a brutal yet extremely profitable industry. And the main commodity in this market was not land, not trophies, but people. Specifically, rich and noble people. The system was called ransom. It was a simple and brilliant economic model. When two knights met in battle, Their goal was not to kill each other, but to force the opponent to surrender. The defeated knight would kneel and utter the cherished words, "I surrender to you." At this moment, he ceased to be an enemy and became an asset, a living, walking bag of gold. He was not tortured. On the contrary, he was treated as an honored guest. For the better his condition, the faster his family or liege lord would gather the money for his ransom. The sums were colossal. The ransom for an ordinary knight could provide for the captor's family for an entire generation. The ransom for a baron could build a castle, and the ransom for a duke could change the financial standing of an entire region. War was a form of high-risk venture capital. You invested money in armor, a horse, and weapons, and if you were lucky, you could return home a multimillionaire. In this system of coordinates, the king was not just a commander-in-chief. He was the grand prize. This was not just an asset, it was an asset with a 1,000-fold multiplier. If a common knight was a small company's stock, the king was a controlling stake in Apple. The most striking example is the Battle of Poitiers, 1356. The English captured the French king John II the Good. A ransom of 3 million gold crowns was demanded for him. Let's try to grasp this figure. 3 million crowns is approximately 11 tons of pure gold. But even that doesn't convey the scale. This sum was twice the entire annual income of the French kingdom. The whole country, all taxes, all duties for 2 years, just to get one man back. France was on the verge of collapse. They had to debase the coinage and introduce emergency taxes, which led to peasant revolts. Now let's return to our archer at Agincourt. Imagine that he miraculously kills the French king. What does he get? Nothing. Perhaps praise from his lord. But what does his lord lose, and the entire English crown? They lose the biggest jackpot in history. Killing a king in this system is like finding a money-printing press and burning it. It's economic madness. So the archer, by shooting the knight next to the king, acted absolutely logically. He was eliminating the guard, clearing the way, so that his lord could capture the main prize. But even these astronomical sums are nothing compared to the second, far more compelling reason. Killing a king was not just unprofitable. It was a direct insult to God. For the king on the battlefield was not just a commander-in-chief. He was something more. To understand what a king truly was in the Middle Ages, we need to leave the battlefield and enter the quiet, dim light of a grand cathedral. It was here, not in battle, that his true armor was forged. The coronation ceremony was not just a political inauguration. It was a sacred ritual, a sacrament. The central moment was the anointing. The archbishop dipped his fingers in holy oil, chrism, and drew a cross on the forehead, chest, and hands of the future monarch. At this moment, people believed God's grace descended upon him. He ceased to be merely a man. He became God's anointed, Christ's representative on earth. His authority now came not from the army, not from the people, and not even from the nobility. It came directly from heaven. He was the key link in the chain that connected the world of men with the divine order. He was the guarantor of stability. As long as he lived and ruled, the sun rose, crops grew, and society did not descend into chaos. Now let's return to our archer on the field. To kill an ordinary knight was a sin that could be atoned for. But to aim an arrow at God's anointed was not just murder. It was sacrilege, blasphemy. It was like spitting in the face of the Almighty Himself. And the fear of consequences was absolutely real. People believed that such an act would bring divine retribution, not only upon the archer himself, but upon his entire army, his entire country. Drought, plague, defeat in the next battle, all of this could be the result of violating this sacred taboo. To a modern person, especially in the U.S., a country founded on the rejection of monarchical power, this might sound strange. But try to imagine. For a medieval soldier, killing a king would be equivalent to an American soldier during the War of Independence being ordered to burn the original Declaration of Independence. It wasn't just paper. It was a sacred symbol, the source of all legitimacy. To kill a king was to declare that any commoner with a bow could destroy the divine order. This undermined the foundations of power, not only of the enemy monarch, but also of one's own. For if one anointed of God could be killed by a common peasant's arrow, so could another. This opened Pandora's box. So the king was protected by gold and God. Not bad security. It seemed like an impenetrable wall, but there was a third, far more practical defense that saved his life every day. Even if our archer had been a cynical atheist who cared nothing for money or faith, he would still have faced an almost insurmountable problem, a thick, impenetrable fog, the fog of war. Let's momentarily put ourselves in our archer's shoes, squint, and look at the battlefield through his eyes. The first thing you realize is the distance. 200 yards is the length of 2 American football fields end to end. Your target is a man, a figure the size of your thumb held at arm's length. Now add the conditions. This isn't a sunny day at the firing range. It's hell on earth. You're looking through a haze of smoke, rain, and mist. In front of you are 10,000 people, screaming, fighting, and dying. This isn't a static target. It's a chaotically moving mass. You're looking for the king. But what are you looking at? Shining armor? A rich coat of arms? The problem is that hundreds of people on the battlefield look like the king. All the high aristocracy, dukes, counts, powerful barons, wore the highest quality armor, often no less grand than the king's. Their coats of arms were just as intricate and vibrant. From 200 yards, in the mud and confusion, Distinguishing the king's coat of arms from his duke cousins was practically impossible. It's like a Where's Waldo game, except all the other characters are also wearing red and white stripes, and the picture itself is on fire and trying to kill you. But kings and their commanders were not fools. They knew about this problem, and they actively exploited it. Around the monarch was always his personal guard, the elite of the elite. These knights wore armor and coats of arms as similar as possible to the king's. Their task was to create a living shield, and more importantly, visual noise, confusion. And sometimes the deception was even more direct. At the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, the English king Henry IV used several knights in full royal regalia as decoys. Chronicles report that the rebels killed several kings before reaching the real one. This was a standard and very effective tactic. So you are an archer. You look at a group of shining knights 200 yards away. Which one is the king? Which one is his bodyguard? And which one is just a decoy, doomed to die? Any mistake is a wasted arrow that could have killed another, very real enemy. It's like trying to pick out a quarterback from the upper stands during a snowstorm when his entire team is wearing identical numbers. But let's imagine our archer got lucky. The wind died down, the smoke cleared. He sees the standard bearer, he sees the personal guard, and in the center high, one man whose position and armor leave no doubt. He is 100% sure. He aims, and still doesn't shoot. Why? Because he knew what awaited him in case of success. And that fear was based on unwritten rules that were more important than any royal decree. Medieval warfare, especially between powerful feudal lords and kings, was a strange hybrid. On one hand, brutality, blood, death. On the other, a code of unwritten rules, observed almost as strictly as laws. And these rules protected not just life, but the very order of things. Imagine a club, a very exclusive, very old club, whose members are the wealthiest and most influential people in Europe. It's a club of rulers, aristocrats, knights. What bound these club members was more than just common interests. They were bound by common blood, in the sense of noble birth. For these people, war was not just a battle for territory or power. It was, first and foremost, a way of settling disputes between equals. It was a ritual. And this ritual had its taboos. The main taboo, killing someone from one's own circle. This particularly applied to killing a king. To kill a king meant to destroy the entire system. It was equivalent to what would happen today if a common trader on Wall Street killed the head of the Federal Reserve. It's not just a crime. It's a blow to the very heart of the financial system. I don't kill your king, you don't kill mine. This was a silent but absolutely real agreement. It was mutual insurance for the elites. As long as they adhered to this agreement, their lives, their wealth, their families were protected. For a commoner, for that same archer, the difference between killing a common knight and killing a king was enormous. By killing a knight, he fulfilled his duty, received a reward from his lord. It was right within his world. But to kill a king, that was beyond the pale. That was not his right. In medieval society, everything was strictly hierarchical. Everyone had their place, and a commoner had no right to raise a hand against the highest authority. It was not just a violation of law. It was a violation of the natural divine order itself. The execution of the archer who killed King Richard the Lionheart was a terrible confirmation of this. He wasn't just hanged. He was flayed alive. It was not punishment. It was a ritual act of intimidation. To show everyone, this is what will happen if you, a worm, dare to encroach upon a sacred thing. This fear worked. It was stronger than the fear of death in battle. Better to die from an enemy arrow than to be captured and executed by your own for such a crime. This fragile balance rested on honor, fear, and mutual benefit. As long as they adhered to this agreement, their lives, their families, their wealth were protected. But one day, the English decided that victory was more important than the rules. We need to return to the mud of Agincourt to see how this system fractured. Let's return to the mud of Agincourt. Henry II's English army was on the verge of annihilation. They were outnumbered, by some estimates, 3-1. They were sick, hungry, and cut off from home. The French army, in contrast, was fresh, superbly equipped, and absolutely confident of victory. For the French nobility, this was not a battle, but a hunt. They saw easy prey before them and anticipated glory and rich ransoms. They intended to fight by the rules like true knights. But Henry V understood that playing by the rules meant certain death. He had one trump card, his archers, and he decided to use it not as a scalpel, but as a sledgehammer. What happened next forever changed the face of warfare. Henry did not order his archers to target specific aristocrats. He gave a different order, to create a killing zone. He transformed his line of archers into a unified, impersonal mechanism of destruction. When the French knights, encased in tons of steel, advanced across the viscous, muddy field, hell rained down upon them. Imagine not individual arrows, but a solid steel downpour. 100,000 arrows per minute. The air turned into deadly shrapnel. And that wall of steel didn't care who you were. An arrow loosed with enough force to pierce an oak door didn't check your coat of arms before embedding itself in a helmet's eye slit. It didn't distinguish a duke from a common squire. The French nobility who went into battle expecting honorable duels and wealthy prisoners were ground to pieces. They fell, pierced by dozens of arrows, drowned in the mud under the weight of their own armor, crushed by their own falling horses. This was not a battle, it was a slaughter. For the surviving French, it was not merely a military defeat. It was a profound humiliation. They, the elite of society, God's anointed, were indiscriminately destroyed by commoners with pieces of wood. Their entire world, built on hierarchy and rules, was trampled in the mud of Agincourt. But there was one instance when the rule was broken, and a king was killed by an arrow. The consequences of this act became a legend, and the most terrifying warning for anyone who dared to raise a bow against a monarch. This is the story of the most famous crusader, Richard the Lionheart. This happened in 1199, almost 200 years before Agincourt. King Richard I the Lionheart, a legend of the Crusades, was besieging the tiny, almost insignificant castle of Chalus-Chabrol in France. It was not an epic battle. Rather, it was a police operation against a rebellious vassal. On the evening of March 25th, Richard, confident in his safety, walked along the siege lines without full armor, wearing only a helmet. He mockingly applauded the castle's defenders. At that moment, one of the crossbowmen on the wall, by some accounts a mere boy, took aim and fired. The crossbow bolt struck the king in his left shoulder, at the base of his neck. The wound itself was not immediately fatal. But when the court surgeon, whom one chronicler called a butcher, tried to extract the arrowhead, he only worsened the injury. Gangrene set in. The King of England, the greatest warrior of his time, was dying a slow and agonizing death from blood poisoning. Feeling the end approach, Richard ordered the archer brought before him. Everyone expected an order for a brutal execution. But Richard, in an act of royal mercy and knightly honor, looked at his killer and asked why he had shot. The archer boldly replied that Richard had killed his father and 2 brothers, and he was taking revenge. Struck by such courage, Richard forgave him. He ordered the archer released, and even gave him 100 shillings as a gift. The king was dying, but he died by the rules of his class, showing mercy to a defeated enemy. And then the king died. As soon as his last breath left his body, all rules, all honor, all royal mercy evaporated with him. A mercenary named Mercadier, one of Richard's loyal captains, overturned the royal order. He seized that very archer and subjected him to one of the most agonizing executions known in the Middle Ages. He was flayed alive and then hanged. The execution of this archer became a signal to all: even if the king forgives you, the system never will. This was not just an act of revenge. It was a brutal reminder of what awaited a commoner who dared to raise a weapon against God's anointed. This fear worked for centuries. But on the horizon the smoke from fuses was already visible, and a new weapon which cared nothing for kings, gods, or gold was preparing to enter the stage. The sound of war changed. It was no longer the hum of 1,000 bowstrings and the whistle of arrows. It was a roar, a deep, earth-shaking rumble, followed by a cloud of acrid gray smoke. It was the sound of the arquebus, and it became the death knell for an entire era. Firearms were not simply an improved bow. They were fundamentally different. They were the great equalizer. To become an archer required a lifetime. Years of training from childhood to develop incredible strength in the back and shoulders. An archer was an elite, a professional, the product of long and expensive preparation. To become an arquebusier, took a few weeks. Any peasant could be taught to load, aim, and pull the trigger. The weapon no longer required strength or noble birth, but most importantly, it didn't care about armor. The finest armor, a work of art by Milanese masters, costing a fortune, all of it became useless. A simple lead ball, fired from an iron tube, pierced right through it. The entire economy of status, expressed in steel, collapsed overnight. And finally, it was anonymous. A shot from a bow was personal. An arquebusier, however, fired from a cloud of smoke, his face hidden. Killing became impersonal, mechanical. This new technology didn't just change tactics. It destroyed the very ethos of chivalric warfare. All the unwritten rules, all the gentlemen's agreements, lost their meaning when any former farmer could kill the most powerful duke from 100 yards away. This tactic, the deliberate destruction of enemy command, found its horrifying culmination on the battlefields of the American Civil War. At the beginning of the conflict, many officers on both sides still considered it bad form to deliberately shoot at enemy commanders. But very soon, Union snipers with their Sharps rifles began systematically picking off Confederate officers. It was brutal, ungentlemanly, but incredibly effective. A Union sniper, hiding behind a tree at Gettysburg and targeting a general in a gray uniform, was the direct descendant of that European arquebusier, who first understood that killing one general was more important than killing 10 soldiers. With the advent of the musket, the king on the battlefield transformed from a demigod into the biggest and most desirable target. His bright clothing, his standard-bearers, his guard, everything that had once been a symbol of power now became a target indicator. All his invisible armor of tradition and faith crumbled to dust. But what does this tell us about ourselves? When we look at that archer at Agincourt who refused to shoot, we don't see a coward or a fool. We see a man living by the laws of a different universe. So why didn't that archer at Agincourt shoot the king? The answer turned out to be more complex than we thought. It wasn't about his eyes, his hand, or his bow. It was about what was behind his eyes, in his consciousness, in the very operating system of the medieval world. The king's true armor was invisible. It wasn't forged from steel. It was woven from gold, from the cynical but iron logic of Ransom, which made a living king priceless and a dead one useless. Beneath the layer of gold was the armor of faith, an impenetrable cuirass of divine right that transformed the king into a sacred figure. An attack on him was an attack on the world order itself, on God himself. This armor was hidden by a cloak of invisibility, the fog of war. Chaos, smoke, and deliberate confusion made the king an almost invisible target, protecting him better than any bodyguard. And binding it all together was the brutal logic of class society, an unwritten law that stated a commoner had no right to take the life of an aristocrat. It was a taboo the violation of which was punished by a tormenting death that served as a warning to all. The archer didn't loose his arrow not because he couldn't, but because it was unthinkable to do so. The weight of his entire civilization, the entire economy, all religion, and all social order pressed on his fingers, preventing him from making the fatal shot. We look at this from our time and see a missed tactical opportunity. They looked at it from their time and saw an act of suicidal madness that would bring down the wrath of heaven and their own lords upon their heads. The story of why archers didn't shoot kings is not a story about weapons. It's a story about how invisible rules, shared beliefs, and collective myths can be stronger than any steel. It's about how ideas shape reality, dictating who lives and who dies. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story about how quickly this invisible armor can crumble to dust. One technological leap, one desperate decision in the mud at Agincourt is enough to change the world forever. And the most sacred rules rewritten in a new, far more brutal hand. Thank you for joining me on this journey. History is full of such invisible rules that seem strange to us today. But for the people of that time, they were the foundation of the entire world order. If you know of other similar gentlemen's agreements in history, from the ancient world to the Cold War era, I would be very happy to read about them in the comments. This is an incredibly interesting topic. Your support in the form of a subscription and a like allows me to delve deeper into such stories and spend weeks researching details that remain off-screen. If you want to see more such investigations, you know what to do. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so we can meet again. See you soon.